What is your best "one time my dad" story? One time, my dad took my brother's walkie-talkie and had us and about 10 kids in the neighborhood convinced that we had picked up a signal from a plane that was crashing towards the earth. We ran up and down the streets for an hour with our eyes open on the sky, listening as the pilot tried to reach someone for help. Dad's windows were open, so we eventually caught on to the heinous laughter echoing between the houses after every Mayday. One time, my dad waited till my 3 siblings and I had gone to bed on Christmas Eve. Then he shouted, "I don't care who you are, fat man! Get that slit off of my roof!" We were all up and telling Dad not to yell at Santa. One time, my dad's fart smelled so bad, my dog threw up. So we were having a family dinner over the summer, and my sister had been at a barbecue the day before, and the host gave her a big bowl of fruit salad to take home. We were sitting there having dinner, and my dad is staring at the fruit salad with this weird look on his face, and he says, "What are these little blue things?" while holding up a blueberry. We were like, "How the hell do you not know what a blueberry is?" Then realized my mom hates blueberries, so the dude hasn't seen a blueberry in 45 years and forgot they existed. One time, when I was about 10, my dad called me into his room. He and my mom were there, completely naked, standing around and laying their clothes down ready to get dressed. They acted like the situation was completely normal and asked me about some random thing. I eventually blocked this memory out and thought it to be a dream. But then 10 years later, they told me that was their way of showing me what a body looked like because I was getting close to that age. I can't argue with their logic, but I question their methods. This was a few years back, but my dad really got into my pot brownies. The only way I know this is because I woke up in the middle of the night to him putting baby socks on my dog. His only statement was, "Dogs shouldn't have cold feet." One time my dad saw I was in a really low mood, so he walked into my room, grabbed my trash Hatsune Miku wig and my swim goggles, put them both on, and followed me around for a solid 10 minutes, completely nonchalantly to make me laugh. Imagine, if you will, a large, imposing black man wearing a teal pigtailed wig and goggles so old they're turning brown, casually making himself a sandwich. One time my dad came home after I had a party at the house. There were girls dancing together on the pool table and one of them had Cheeto dust on their fingers. I tried to clean it but couldn't get all of it off before they got home. He called me downstairs and asks about the marks on the table. I couldn't think of a lie, so I just told him the truth. He stares at me for a couple of seconds and then says, "Nice." One time, my dad almost slit my throat because he thought I was a burglar. I had snuck downstairs for some reason. I was in the kitchen and heard him coming in, so I hid behind the kitchen counter. Heard my dad opening drawers and things. Next thing I knew, he had leaned over the counter and grabbed my head, had a kitchen knife to my throat. A split second later, he realized it was me and dropped me, and then I got yelled at because he had heard me breathing, thought I was a home intruder, and I almost got in a world of pain. He was shaking from adrenaline. As a dad now myself, I can imagine the state of mind he was in. One time, my dad was sitting on the couch in our living room. Mom brought out a bag of sugar and asked him to open it. He opened it like it was a bag of Doritos, and I mean, it was everywhere. He was only wearing his shorts, so there was sugar in just about every square inch of his visible hair, as well as all over our couch and carpet. Took him 4 showers in a row to get it all off. One time, my dad literally took candy from a baby. A 2-year-old held up a lollipop and my dad assumed the kid was giving it to him. After taking it and walking away, he realized the toddler probably just wanted to show it to him. One time, my dad made a remote control car and put me as a toddler on it and drove me around. According to my grandmother, my dad, on his first day of school back in the 60s, came home all smiles and laughter. The next day when my grandmother awoke him for his second day of school, he matter-of-factly replied, "No, I've already been to school." He really thought school was something like the dentist or inoculations where you only have to go once, and that's it, lol. One time, my dad was on a business trip and he ended up getting upgraded to first class. He ended up talking with this guy seated near him for the majority of the flight. Turned out that guy was Usher. One time, my dad made me drive 3 hours from home to visit a nature preserve. He then began taking pictures of the birds there. Just one problem, the birds were plastic. Turns out the flocks had stopped migrating back to the preserve, so they put up plastic birds for tourists. The funniest part was how long it took him to listen to me telling him that they were plastic. One time, we went to Universal Studios and my dad took me on the Hulk roller coaster even though he knew it would make him sick. I was afraid of coasters at that point, and he sacrificed himself because he knew I would never go on the ride without him. When we got off, his face was completely colorless and his stomach was done working correctly for the rest of the day. But I loved the roller coaster. My dad was a fireman and picked me up from a school in a fire engine once. One time, my dad went to my school event in jeans, a jean shirt, and a jean jacket. My dad once put off going to the optometrist for 3 years. When he finally went, it turned out his right eye was in charge of looking at things far away and his left eye only looked at things up close. Sometimes during those 3 years, he became farsighted and his brain compensated. When I was 17, my crush arrived to pick me up to go hang out. He didn't come to the front door, he just honked from the driveway. So my dad got all pissy. That's not how you treat a lady. Honking is unacceptable, and didn't let me go out. He brought up that scenario repeatedly for years as a baseline for how my date should treat me. He hated that guy. I got married a few years later and my husband died a few years into our relationship. A few years after he died, I was joking with my dad about the guy honking his horn, and my dad looked at me and says, "Wait, that was the same guy?" "Yes, Dad, that was the same guy." He'd never realized that I'd married the honking guy. I didn't know that he didn't know. My kids love that story. It's pretty hilarious. My stepmom owns a couple of hot dog stands that are located in Home Depots. Every summer, she caters for an outdoor movie night event for the community of her cousin. It's an all-day event, and when I was in college, they asked me to help out and gave me the money they got paid so I could have some money for school. The morning of the event, I got to my dad's house and started helping him load the hot dog cart onto the back of his truck. All of a sudden, this SUV starts speeding down the alley. My dad narrowly avoids getting hit, but as the SUV passes, it took out the driver's side mirror of my dad's truck. The SUV then stops a few houses down and the guy jumps out and runs into a house. My dad and I both look at each other really confused, and then went to check out the damage. The mirror was hanging off, so we had to start figuring out a way to tape it on because we needed to make the hour-and-a-half long drive to the event. After a few minutes, the guy from the SUV comes back out and walks towards us. My dad was pretty mad and looked ready to confront him. The guy stops right in front of the mirror, looks at it, turns to us and says, "I'm so sorry, I was about to crap myself." I could barely withhold my laughter, and although my dad was still visibly mad, I could tell he thought it was funny too. The guy ended up paying for the mirror, but the whole thing was such a weird interaction. One time, my dad crapped his jeans on the side of the road on the way to my volleyball tournament. We were running late for the tournament, so he threw the pants in the woods and had dress pants in the car. He walked around the tournament all day in a red volleyball sweatshirt and pinstripe dress pants. About 5 years ago, my dad accidentally cut 3 of his fingers off in our garage with a saw. My niece was only like 5 months old at the time, so growing up, she's never seen my dad with all of his digits. Anyway, when she was about 2.5, she noticed that one of his hands was different. So one day she asked him, "Grandpappy, what happened to your fingers?" My dad looked down at his hand, all shocked, and said, "Someone stole them!" Her face had a look of pure horror, and she screamed, "Who stole your fingers?" My dad looked at my mom and said, "Grandmommy stole them." My niece ran up to my mom and started beating on her legs, searching her pockets to give back her grandpappy's fingers. My dad, man. This is a dark story, but I still want to tell it because it really means something to me. After my mom and dad got married, my dad would often come home late at night very wasted. Almost every night he would be too wasted to function. My dad never thought twice about his alcoholism until my mother went into labor for the first time, and she was so wasted my mom had to call our next-door neighbor to drive my mom to a hospital. My dad was too wasted to drive his wife to a hospital to give birth to his own son. Since that moment, he has never touched a drink. Me and a few of my friends used to hold a poker night each week, which my dad used to play too. He got particularly wasted one night and was getting on his bicycle to go home. It was icy outside, and we spent around 15 minutes trying to persuade him to have a lift from one of my friends. He refused. 10 minutes later, there's a knock at the front door, and he's there with blood dripping down and covering half his face. All he said was, "I fell over." He then came in, fell over again, washed his face, and went to sleep on the couch. One time, my dad called the phone at my work and asked me where I was and what I was doing. One time, just before I graduated high school, my dad sat me down to have a serious conversation about socializing in college. It turned into him telling me a bunch of crazy party stories and suggesting that the best way to make friends is to own a blender with a 100-feet extension cord because his friends would go outside to play basketball or whatever, and he'd bring his blender out with them and make margaritas. We met so many girls because of that blender. People liked the guy with the blender. My dad is super serious and straight-laced most of the time. It totally caught me off guard. One time, when my dad was in college, he almost caused a biohazard shutdown across campus. In central Arkansas, he was able to hunt a ton of squirrels. He did so and put the frozen bodies in his dorm freezer so that he could have a large cooking party once he was done. A few days after the freezer got full, he went home as part of Thanksgiving vacation. Little did he know the school shuts off the power in the dorms when the students leave. So what happens to 20 squirrel carcasses after they defrost and stew in their own decaying muck? Well, he got back, he noticed a smell outside of his dorm. It was so foul he could taste it. In a moment of instant clarity, he knew why. Very few people were there yet, and he was one of the first to return. As he climbed up the steps to his third-story room, the smell got so bad he had to stop and puke twice. Once on his floor, he ran to get to his room so that he couldn't stop and think about what he was doing. His actual room had a literal gas cloud of rotten death. Working on instinct more than thought, my dad ran in, grabbed the squirrel carcass mush bag from his freezer. He opened his third-story window and chucked it out onto the sidewalk, with people. My dad could see the bag tumble down through the air and split immediately on impact. There was a crowd of people, including the local firefighters, to see what was causing the mess. Luckily, his bag went wide by about 20 feet, but as soon as it burst, people ran. At the dean's office, my father was asked, "College ain't the right fit for you, is it, son?" My dad agreed and left that college without any kind of backlash, then finished his degree elsewhere. I will start this by saying my dad used to be a drug addict. He was in one of the many attempts to get clean at this point. So one time, my dad decides to take all three of us to a cemetery and tell us to look for one of the oldest graves that we could find. I was about 10, my sister was 9, and my brother was 6. We found this little girl that died in the late 1800s around the age of 6 or so. We didn't know why we were doing this, but we went along. He pulls out this pipe out of his pocket and proceeds to give us this long drawn-out speech about how the path he is on is going to lead him to where we were standing. He then swore on that girl's grave that he would never touch the pipe again and smashed the pipe on her headstone. Of course, that promise was broken, but maybe he just meant that pipe because he had already smashed it. My mom flipped crap when she took us home, and she found out. One time, my dad took me over to my uncle's house. My uncle made my twin and I chug orange juice as a contest. We thought it was funny. Turns out we were chugging it so my uncle could pour alcohol in it and get wasted before my dad drove him to rehab. So that was fun. One time, my friends and I were having a camp out near the pond on my parents' property. My dad had this Bigfoot costume that he saved specifically for times like these, and I should have known better. Well, it was just getting dark and we were sitting around the campfire talking, and we started hearing branches cracking in the bushes near our camping spot. All of a sudden, my dad, in his Bigfoot costume, comes flying out of the brush. Needless to say, we almost all peed ourselves. One time, my dad was an absolute badass working from 5 in the morning till at least 6 at night on the family farm. Every day of the week, every week of the year for 40 years. My dad's always been a superhero to me. One time, my dad got way into a game of volleyball. Our family had a barbecue out by the lake, and the adults decided to start a game. Somebody served the ball way past the boundaries, and my dad, being the competitive man that he is, still runs for the ball. He runs for it, then tries to jump for it sideways. He practically flew into the men's room nearby and fell right into the closed stall, leaving a huge dent in the door and hauling ass out of there immediately with the ball, of course. Moments later, some guy comes out of the men's room looking confused as hell. At this point, everyone is dying of laughter. That story comes up quite often when the family gets together. One time, my dad set someone on fire. He was standing with a group of people having a smoke, and this girl walked up and asked for a light. My dad said, "Sure." She leant in as he lit the lighter, and her hair went right into the flame, causing her hair to catch fire. Apparently, someone had a little too much hairspray. She was fine and didn't suffer any serious injuries. My dad still tells people the story to this day. I know this probably won't be seen, however, still a great story. My parents have been divorced since I was 2. Even though I still saw my mom on the weekends, I grew up as a daddy's girl. My dad was always the one to really take care of me, spoil me, etc. Anyway, when I was younger, I had always wanted to go to Disney World, but it was way too expensive. Finally, at 13, my dad decided that since my grandpa had moved to Florida, we could go visit him and go to Disney World. My dad has always been a little Danny Tannerish and wore a fanny pack. One of the days, we decided to just go to the ocean with my great aunt. My aunt and I started feeding the seagulls, and my dad was just chilling in one of those low-to-the-ground beach chairs with his fanny pack next to it. All of a sudden, the tide comes up and sweeps up my dad's fanny pack. My aunt and I are still feeding seagulls, and then out of nowhere on a packed beach, my dad starts yelling, "My purse! My purse!" and starts running and falling into the ocean. My aunt and I just started dying laughing. My dad did retrieve his purse, and he told us not to say anything to Grandpa. As soon as I got back to Grandpa's house, I said, "Oh my God, Grandpa, guess what Dad just did?" One time, my dad and I built a potato cannon. We proceeded to launch potatoes into orbit from the backyard, until we heard a car alarm go off on the next street, somewhere in the general direction of where we launched the potato. Oops. One time, my dad swatted a spider off the ceiling and into the toilet, then flushed it. One time, my dad came home quite wasted after a party, which is really unusual for him. He grabbed me and said, "Son, promise me you will never dress up as a girl." I never had the guts to ask him about that since. One time, my dad was messing around with the ticket to get out of the car park. He was messing around and pretending to put it in the CD player, and the machine sucked it in. We had to pay for the lost ticket fee and go out when we had already paid for the time that we had been there. It took weeks to get it back out. We still laugh about it now. My mom, sister, and I cannot believe how daft he can be sometimes. The stories that will be told to his grandchildren. One time, my dad's pub in Africa was held up by two guys with guns. They ran in brandishing weapons, and one held a gun to my dad's head and demanded money. Everyone in the place froze up, scared that they'd somehow wind these guys up and they'd kill somebody. My dad turned his head to look at the guy who had the gun to his head and saw the little orange water nozzle at the end of the gun. So he ripped it out of the guy's hand and beat the crap out of him. The night watchman's security showed up and grabbed the other guy who tried to make a run for it and handed his ass to him as well. My father was in special forces during the 80s and early 90s, and one day during first grade, I brought my father to school, and his first words were, "You kids want to know how I got this gun wound and killed two men?" One time on Halloween, trick-or-treaters came to the door and my dad answered. One of them says, "Trick or treat," to which my dad replies, "Treat please." The kids all look at each other confused. One of them reluctantly hands him a Kit Kat. Dad thanks them and then shuts the door. We didn't get any more trick-or-treaters that year. I pray this doesn't get buried. Once my dad got so wasted he stole a Shetland pony and tried to keep it in the kitchen. My mom went ballistic while my dad was trying to feed the pony carrots. So my dad is an intellectual type. He attends public lectures on philosophy and science in his free time. He was attending one on theories of consciousness that had a Q&A session. The speaker was a mind functionalist. The TLDR explanation is he subscribes to the idea that the mind is a description of function. Humans can do X, Y, and Z things, therefore they have minds. Consequently, if a machine, alien, or whatever can do basically the same stuff, they therefore have a mind. My dad raised a common criticism which runs like this. A large group of beings, human or otherwise, could function together similar to a single person, but it sounds odd to say they therefore all have a shared mind. He used an example of ants operating in a hive intelligently. By functionalism, we might conclude the hive itself has a mind. Dad meant this as a criticism, but I guess that wasn't clear. After the talk was over, a guy comes over to my dad. He's super excited and complimentary. Even though Dad only spoke for a few minutes, this guy seems overly inspired by him. He keeps saying stuff about how your ant analogy was so insightful. I can tell you're a real intellectual. He asks if Dad attended Oxford or Cambridge University. My dad says yes, Oxford. He is smug, I could tell. Then it gets weirder. The guy makes strange veiled comments as if he's trying to tease something out of Dad without asking outright. I never thought I'd meet someone like you. I know you're not like other people. It's okay, I know you can talk about it here. This guy is also handing out some kind of shoddy-looking pamphlet about his church to anyone who is interested. Dad takes one but doesn't read it until he gets home that night. And that's when it all became clear. It is obvious from early on that this is not a mainstream church but some kind of weird space cult. There is a central belief that all life, plant/bacteria, etc., has the capacity to become conscious. However, those that are were made so by a super advanced race of aliens. At some time in the distant past, they descended and made humans and some animals conscious. Their ultimate goal is to make all life in the universe consciousness, but if they do this now in our violent state, it would be a disaster. We already inflict so much suffering as it is that if all plants and insects could suffer too, it would be horrific. First, we need to become enlightened and empathetic before the aliens will extend consciousness on our world. So how to achieve this? Well, the benevolent aliens cannot force us to be peaceful against our will, as this is against their nature. They can, however, attempt to influence our cultures in a peaceful direction through dialogue. The aliens know they cannot appear in their true form because this could cause more war. So instead, they disguise themselves as humans on Earth, wishing to be influential and possessing superior intellect. They easily find places in our best universities like Oxford and Cambridge. Once they attain degrees or positions, and knowing that they will be respected and listened to, they then travel the globe spreading the single message that all forms of life from humans to lowly ants have the capacity to be conscious. One time, my dad went to Costco to buy batteries. He spent $500. He forgot the batteries. When I was a child, around 8 or 9 years old, my parents and I were vacationing in Las Vegas, staying at the MGM Grand. Downstairs in a hotel were shops and restaurants, and I had to use the bathroom. I went into the stall, did my business, and then to my childlike horror, I discovered the door was stuck. The door was the type close to the floor, and there wasn't room to crawl out. I yelled for my dad, who was using the urinal. He walks over, grabs the door, and literally yanks it off its hinges, like it was nothing. Sets the door against the wall, and we just walk out. I'll never forget it. One time, my dad saw something glittering across the road from our house. He got the binoculars out and saw it was a shiny coin, likely £1, or so he thought. Ran out of the house and across the road, and we saw him shake his head and walk back. It was a 10p. One time my dad tricked my mom, who is very particular about the water she drinks, into believing she had been drinking fresh water from the cooler we had in our kitchen. Normally, we would replace the 18-liter jug with a fresh new one from the local drugstore. In reality, he had been filling the empty jug with water from the sink in the kitchen. Mom had no idea, and this went on for 3 months until Dad came clean. My dad got bit on the arm by a rattlesnake, and the doctor told him he would have to constantly move his hand to keep the blood flowing during recovery. If he couldn't, they would have to amputate. That's how he learned to play guitar. One time, my dad decided to cut down his own Christmas tree. He drove all around town until he found one that he liked at a nearby farm. He cut about halfway through it before he saw someone coming, and then he left the half-cut tree on the farm and came home. One time, my dad chopped his leg with an axe instead of the log that he was aiming for. One time, my father tried to gain access to a nuclear submarine base. I was vacationing on the Georgia coast with my father and grandfather near Kings Bay Submarine Base, which is the home port of the U.S. Navy's Atlantic Fleet ballistic missile submarines. My grandfather is an Air Force veteran, and for some dumbass reason, my father thought that this would allow us access to one of the most highly secured U.S. military installations in the country. Safe to say it did not. One time, my dad had to fix up my bike when I was a teen. He then proceeded to give it a test run on the driveway and tried doing a wheelie and then crashed and fell off. Also, he made a ramp in the backyard and attempted jumping it with my other bike and fell off too. Good times. One time, my dad was taking a math exam before calculators were everywhere and square roots had to be calculated by hand. The final question on the exam was the square root of 4, and he wrote a half page of work and got a rough estimate. Got the exam back with the written comment, "It's 2." One time, my dad bought a horse and didn't tell my mom. He hid a horse for about 3 years before he had to sell it to buy a boat, which he didn't talk to her about. They are getting a divorce. One time, my dad had to poop so bad on the way to a Yankee game that he stopped at a police station in the Bronx to take a dump. One time, I was coming home from school and I saw my dad smoking a cigarette in the backyard while pouring gasoline into a hole in the ground. I asked him what he was doing, and his reply was to flick his cigarette perfectly into the hole full of gasoline, which resulted in a miniature volcano in my backyard. And with a smug look on his face, he quietly said, "Chipmunks." One time, my family was going for a walk, and my dad and I were goofing around and chasing each other. He grabbed me and pushed me into the grass on a hillside we just walked by. Unfortunately, he didn't see that he pushed me directly into a whole bush of stinging nettle. It was summer and I was just wearing shorts and a t-shirt, and being the little girl I was, I started crying from the pain. My mom, in her motherly protective rage, grabbed some branches of the stinging nettle, not feeling the pain due to the adrenaline pulsing through her body, and chased my father until she whipped him good with the stinging nettle. I was revenged. Thanks for watching until the end. If you have a good dad story, please post it in the comments below. We'd love to hear about it. Then be sure to like this video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so that you know when our next video is available. For more videos like this one right now, please stop by our channel. Thanks again, and see you next time.